Picture this. You're 22 years old, drunk on cheap beer and teenage bravado, stumbling through the streets of London at 2 a.m. Your friends are laughing. The night feels endless. And in your pocket sits a small device that will change your entire life in the next 60 seconds. You don't know it yet, but you're about to learn a lesson that will follow you for decades. Not from a judge, not from your parents, but from a man whose job is to stand perfectly still and say nothing. What happens when an unstoppable force of youthful stupidity meets the immovable object of centuries-old tradition? What occurs when someone trained in discipline faces someone who's never learned it? And most importantly, what can a moment of complete silence teach you about strength that years of shouting never could? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a university student who thought he understood power until he met someone who actually possessed it. This is about what happens when you cross a line you didn't know existed and discover that true authority doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Some lessons cost money. Some cost time. Some cost everything you thought you knew about yourself. This lesson cost Marcus Thompson his whole understanding of what it means to be strong. Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who pushed boundaries. At 22, he stood 6 feet tall with the kind of confident swagger that came from never really facing serious consequences. His father owned 3 successful restaurants in Manchester. His mother taught at the local university, and Marcus himself was coasting through his 3rd year at King's College London, studying business management with grades that were just good enough to keep his parents' money flowing. The evening started like any other Friday night in October 2019. Marcus and his 3 closest friends from university had decided to celebrate the end of midterm exams with what they called a proper London crawl. The plan was simple: start at the pubs near campus, work their way through central London, and end up somewhere memorable. What they hadn't planned was how memorable the night would actually become. By 10 p.m., they had already visited 4 different pubs. Marcus was feeling the familiar warmth of alcohol spreading through his chest, making everything seem funnier and more possible than it really was. His friend James, a sociology major from Birmingham, was telling increasingly elaborate stories about his summer internship. David, who studied computer science and rarely spoke above a whisper when sober, was now lecturing strangers about cryptocurrency. And Tommy, the quiet one from their group, who usually went home by midnight, was suggesting they visit somewhere tourists go so they could mess with people. Marcus liked this version of his friends. He liked this version of himself. The responsible student who attended most of his classes and called his mother every Sunday felt like a costume he could take off on nights like these. When he was drinking, Marcus felt like he became who he was supposed to be: bold, fearless, someone who made things happen instead of just letting them happen to him. "Where should we go next?" James asked as they stumbled out of their 4th pub, the October air hitting them like a cold slap. The streets of London were still busy with people heading home from dinner, tourists consulting maps on their phones, and groups like theirs moving from one place to another. "Buckingham Palace," Tommy said suddenly, his words slightly slurred but his eyes bright with mischief. "I heard they have guards who can't move or talk or anything. Like statues." Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Not just the alcohol, but something else. A challenge. An opportunity to prove something, though he wasn't quite sure what. "That's not true," he said, though he wasn't entirely certain. "Everyone can move. They're just people doing a job." "No, seriously," David chimed in, pulling out his phone. "I read about it. They're called Queen's Guards or something. They have to stand perfectly still for hours. They can't react to anything. People try to make them laugh or get angry all the time, but they just stand there." Marcus stopped walking. His friends continued for a few steps before realizing he wasn't with them. They turned back to find him standing under a street lamp, a strange expression on his face. "How far is Buckingham Palace from here?" "Maybe 20 minutes on the tube," James said slowly. "Why?" "I want to see these guards who can't move." There was something in Marcus's tone that made his friends exchange glances. They all knew that look. It was the same expression he'd had before he'd climbed onto the roof of their dormitory to hang a banner during Freshers' Week. The same look before he talked his way into a VIP section at a club by pretending to be someone's cousin. It was Marcus's "I'm about to do something stupid" face, and his friends had learned it usually meant an interesting night. "What are you thinking?" Tommy asked, though from his grin, he clearly already knew this was going to be good. "I'm thinking," Marcus said, swaying slightly, "that nobody is really unable to move. Everyone has a breaking point. Everyone reacts to something." They made their way to the nearest tube station, the alcohol making the journey feel like an adventure rather than a simple train ride. Marcus spent the 20-minute journey thinking about what he'd heard about the Queen's Guards. He'd seen pictures, of course, and videos on social media of tourists trying to get reactions out of the stoic figures in their red uniforms and tall black hats. But he'd always assumed it was an act, a performance. Real people didn't just stand still while others tried to provoke them. Real people had limits. Marcus had never met anyone who didn't have limits. When they emerged from the tube station near Buckingham Palace, the night air was crisp and clear. The palace itself was lit up against the dark sky, its windows glowing warmly, surrounded by black iron gates and wide stone paths. Even at nearly midnight, there were still people around. Late-night tourists taking photos, couples walking hand in hand, security officers in high-visibility vests keeping a casual eye on things. And there, standing in his sentry box near one of the gates, was exactly what Tommy had described. A Queen's Guard in full ceremonial dress, red tunic with gold buttons gleaming under the lights, black trousers with a red stripe, and the iconic tall black bearskin hat that made him appear nearly 7 feet tall. He held a rifle with a bayonet, and he stood so perfectly still that for a moment, Marcus wondered if it might actually be a very realistic statue. "Look at him," David whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break some sort of spell. "He's not even blinking." Marcus studied the guard more carefully. The man appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with a clean-shaven face that might have been carved from stone. His eyes stared straight ahead, focused on something in the middle distance that only he could see. His breathing was so controlled it was barely visible. Everything about him radiated discipline and control in a way that Marcus had never encountered before. "I bet he's bored out of his mind," Marcus said, loud enough for the guard to hear if he was listening. "Standing there for hours with nothing to do. Must be the most boring job in the world." The guard didn't react, didn't even seem to notice that Marcus had spoken. "Maybe he's asleep with his eyes open," James suggested. "Like horses." Marcus stepped closer. He was now standing just outside the sentry box, close enough that he could see the individual gold threads in the guard's uniform, close enough to smell the leather polish on his boots. "Hello," he said in a conversational tone. "Nice evening, isn't it?" Nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. "I said hello," Marcus repeated, louder this time. Several tourists turned to look, some pulling out their phones to record what they thought might turn into an interesting confrontation. Still nothing. Marcus felt something hot and uncomfortable rise in his chest. It wasn't just the alcohol anymore. It was frustration and something else. Something that felt almost like embarrassment. Here was someone completely ignoring him, treating him like he didn't exist, and doing it so thoroughly that Marcus began to question whether he was actually there at all. "This is ridiculous," he said to his friends, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Nobody ignores people like this. It's rude. Just leave him alone," a middle-aged woman with an American accent called out. "He's doing his job. His job is to stand there," Marcus replied, his voice getting louder. "That's not a real job. That's just playing dress-up." He turned back to the guard, stepping even closer. Now he was standing directly in front of the sentry box, close enough that if the guard had wanted to, he could have reached out and touched Marcus's face with the bayonet on his rifle. "I'm talking to you," Marcus said. "The least you can do is acknowledge that I exist." The guard's eyes remained fixed on that distant point. His breathing stayed perfectly controlled. His posture didn't shift by even a millimeter. Marcus had never felt more ignored in his entire life. It was then that he remembered the small device in his jacket pocket. He bought it online 3 weeks ago as a joke, after his friend David had shown him a video of someone using one on a particularly aggressive drunk guy outside a club. It was a small, cheap taser, barely powerful enough to be more than startling, but Marcus had carried it around campus for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to use it that never came. Until now. Maybe this will get your attention, Marcus said, pulling the small black device from his pocket. His friends, who had been laughing and recording on their phones, suddenly went quiet. Marcus, Tommy said, his voice sharp with sudden sobriety. What you doing? Just proving a point, Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what point that was. All he knew was that this person standing in front of him, this statue of a man who refused to acknowledge his existence, represented everything that Marcus had always been able to charm or intimidate or win over. And for the first time in his life, those tools weren't working. The tourists around them had grown quiet too, sensing that something was about to happen, though none of them were quite sure what. Marcus held up the taser, making sure the guard could see it in his peripheral vision. Last chance, he said. Just say hello. Just nod. Just show me you're human. The guard's expression didn't change. His eyes didn't shift. His breathing remained as steady as a metronome. Marcus felt a surge of anger so intense it surprised him. Without really thinking about what he was doing, without considering the consequences, without remembering where he was or who might be watching, he reached out and pressed the taser against the guard's leg. The small device buzzed and crackled. There was a brief flash of light, and then everything changed. The guard didn't cry out. He didn't jump or fall or even stumble. Instead, something much more remarkable happened. Absolutely nothing. He absorbed the shock without so much as a tremor, without a flinch, without even a change in his breathing pattern. For a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, Marcus stood there with the taser still buzzing against the man's leg, waiting for some kind of reaction, some acknowledgement that he had just done something significant. But the guard simply continued standing exactly as he had been standing, as if Marcus had touched him with a feather instead of an electrical device. It was in that moment, standing in front of Buckingham Palace with a taser in his hand, and the sound of his friends' horrified gasps behind him, that Marcus Thompson realized he had made a terrible mistake. Not because of what might happen to him, though that thought was beginning to creep into his alcohol-clouded mind, but because of what he had just witnessed. He had just seen what real strength looked like, and it was nothing like what he had thought it was. The first thing Marcus noticed was the silence. Not just from the guard, who continued to stand with the same unwavering stillness, but from everything around them. The tourists had stopped talking. His friends had stopped breathing. Even the distant traffic seemed to have paused, as if the entire world was waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus looked down at the taser in his hand, then back up at the guard's face. The man's expression hadn't changed at all. His eyes remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance, his jaw set in the same determined line, his shoulders carrying the same precise military bearing. If Marcus hadn't felt the device discharge, hadn't seen the brief spark of electricity, he might have wondered if it had actually worked. But he knew it had worked. The taser was cheap, but it wasn't broken. He had just delivered an electric shock to a Queen's Guard, and the man had absorbed it like it was nothing more than a gentle touch. "Oh, God," James whispered from somewhere behind him. "Oh, God, Marcus, what have you done?" Marcus wanted to answer, but he found that his own voice had disappeared. He was still standing directly in front of the sentry box, close enough to see the individual fibers in the guard's red tunic, close enough to notice that despite what had just happened, the man's breathing remained perfectly controlled. In and out. Steady as a clockwork mechanism, as if his body was operating according to some internal discipline that existed entirely separate from external circumstances. The guard's rifle remained at exactly the same angle. His white gloves showed no tremor. His black boots stayed planted in precisely the same position they had been in when Marcus first approached 20 minutes ago. Everything about his posture radiated a kind of control that Marcus was beginning to realize he had never encountered before. "Sir, step away from the guard." The voice came from behind Marcus, calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. He turned to see two Metropolitan Police officers approaching, their high-visibility vests bright under the palace lights. The older of the two, a woman in her 40s with graying hair, pulled back in a neat bun, gestured for Marcus to move away from the sentry box. Marcus's friends immediately stepped back, creating distance between themselves and what was clearly about to become a very serious situation. David had already put his phone away. Tommy was staring at the ground. James kept opening and closing his mouth like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. "I didn't really hurt him," Marcus said, his words coming out in a rush. "It was just a joke. A stupid joke. Look, he's fine. He doesn't even care." The female officer looked at the taser still in Marcus's hand, then at the guard, who continued to stand in exactly the same position he had been in throughout the entire incident. "Sir, I need you to put that device on the ground and step away from it." Marcus looked down at his hand, as if surprised to find the taser still there. The whole thing felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else. Just an hour ago, he had been laughing with his friends in a pub, arguing about football, and complaining about his upcoming economics exam. Now he was standing in front of Buckingham Palace being confronted by police officers while tourists recorded everything on their phones. He set the taser down on the ground and took several steps back, his legs feeling strangely weak. The alcohol that had made him feel bold and invincible 20 minutes ago now just made everything feel fuzzy and disconnected. "What's your name?" the officer asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Marcus Thompson." "And what exactly did you think you were doing, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus looked back at the guard, hoping to find some kind of answer in the man's face. But the guard's expression remained completely neutral, giving nothing away. It was as if the entire incident had never happened, as if Marcus was invisible, as if the world around the sentry box simply didn't exist for him. "I don't know," Marcus said finally, and realized it was the most honest thing he had said all evening. "I really don't know." The second police officer, a younger man with a serious expression, had moved closer to examine the taser without touching it. "This is an electrical device," he said to his partner. "Definitely capable of delivering shock." "Are you injured?" the female officer asked the guard directly. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. Finally, the guard would have to respond. He would have to break his silence, acknowledge what had happened, maybe even show some human reaction to having been assaulted by a drunk university student. But the guard said nothing. His eyes didn't shift toward the officer. His mouth didn't open. He simply continued standing in exactly the same position, breathing with the same controlled rhythm, maintaining the same perfect military bearing that he had displayed throughout the entire incident. The officer waited for a full 30 seconds before turning back to Marcus. "The guard is clearly not going to respond while on duty," she said. "But that doesn't mean what you did isn't serious. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is a criminal offense." "Assaulting?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I barely touched him. And he's fine. Look at him, he's obviously fine." "The fact that Guard Coleman chose not to react doesn't mean you didn't commit assault," the officer replied. "In fact, it makes what you did even more serious." Guard Coleman. The guard had a name. For some reason, this simple fact hit Marcus harder than anything else that had happened. This wasn't just a statue or a tourist attraction or a symbol. This was an actual person named Coleman who got up in the morning and put on a uniform and came to work and stood in this box for hours, dealing with people like Marcus every single day. "How do you know his name?" Marcus asked. "Because I know all the guards who work this shift," the officer replied. Guard Coleman has been standing in this position for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He has another hour and 20 minutes left in his watch. During that time, he has been approached by approximately 60 tourists, had his photo taken roughly 200 times, been asked questions by dozens of people, and has maintained perfect discipline throughout all of it. What you did tonight isn't the worst thing that's happened to him this week. Marcus stared at Guard Coleman, with new eyes. "What do you mean the worst thing?" The officer studied Marcus for a moment, as if deciding whether he was worth educating. "Yesterday, a group of teenagers spent 20 minutes trying to make him laugh by making faces and telling jokes. When that didn't work, they started throwing small objects at his feet. The day before that, a drunk man urinated near his sentry box and then tried to get a selfie with him. Last week, someone's child was allowed to bang on his rifle with a toy hammer while the parents took photos and laughed. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, and he just stood there for all of that. Guard Coleman is a member of the Grenadier Guards, the officer said. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He has been trained to maintain discipline under circumstances that would break most people. Standing still while tourists try to provoke him is not the most challenging thing he's ever done. The weight of what the officer was saying began to sink in. Marcus looked at Guard Coleman again, trying to see past the ceremonial uniform to the actual person underneath. Here was someone who had chosen to serve his country, who had faced real danger in a war zone, who had trained for years to develop the kind of self-control that Marcus couldn't maintain for 5 minutes in a university lecture. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Marcus repeated quietly. And that's just what I can tell you, the officer said. Guard Coleman's full-service record is not something I'm going to discuss with someone who just assaulted him. The word assaulted hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had assaulted a war veteran. He had attacked someone who had served his country, someone who had volunteered to put himself in danger for the protection of others. And he had done it because the man wouldn't acknowledge his existence, wouldn't give him the attention he felt entitled to. I didn't know, Marcus said, though he knew how pathetic that sounded. I thought it was just an act. I thought he was just standing there because it was easy money or something. Ignorance doesn't excuse assault, the officer replied. And even if Guard Coleman was just a regular person doing an easy job, that still wouldn't give you the right to attack him with an electrical device. Marcus nodded, feeling tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. The alcohol was wearing off, leaving behind a clarity that was almost painful. He could see the situation now from outside himself, could see how he must look to the officers, to the tourists, to his friends. A privileged university student who had never faced real consequences, who had never learned that the world didn't revolve around his need for attention and validation. What happens now, he asked. The officer looked at Guard Coleman, who continued to stand in perfect silence, then back at Marcus. Now, you're going to be arrested for assault. You're going to spend the night in custody. Tomorrow, you'll appear before a magistrate who will decide what happens next. And hopefully you're going to learn something from this experience. As the officer began to recite the formal caution, Marcus found himself looking one more time at Guard Coleman. The man's expression hadn't changed throughout the entire conversation. He hadn't shown satisfaction at seeing Marcus arrested, hadn't shown anger about being attacked, hadn't shown anything at all. He simply continued to perform his duty with the same unwavering dedication he had shown all evening. But now, Marcus thought he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about being emotionless or robotic. This was about having a purpose so clear, a commitment so deep, that external circumstances couldn't shake it. Guard Coleman wasn't ignoring the world around him because he didn't care about it. He was maintaining his post because he cared about it so much that nothing could make him abandon his responsibility. Marcus had spent his entire life looking for shortcuts, for ways to get attention without earning it, for methods to appear strong without actually developing strength. And in 5 minutes, standing in front of Buckingham Palace, he had encountered someone who represented everything he wasn't. Disciplined, dedicated, unshakable. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus realized that Guard Coleman had given him something after all. Not acknowledgement, not attention, not the reaction he had been looking for. Instead, he had given him a mirror, a chance to see what he looked like when stripped of all his usual tricks and charms and manipulations. And Marcus didn't like what he saw. The last thing he noticed as the police officers led him away was that Guard Coleman remained in exactly the same position, breathing with the same steady rhythm, eyes fixed on the same distant point. The incident that had changed Marcus's entire understanding of himself hadn't even caused the guard to shift his weight from one foot to the other. That, Marcus was beginning to realize, was what real strength looked like. The holding cell at the West End Central Police Station was nothing like what Marcus had expected from watching television shows. It was smaller, cleaner, and much quieter than he had imagined. The walls were painted a dull, institutional green, The floor was concrete covered with a thin layer of some kind of rubbery material, and the single bench was made of molded plastic that was both too hard and too cold to be comfortable. Marcus sat on that bench for 6 hours, from just after 1 a.m. until nearly 7 in the morning, and during those 6 hours, he had more time to think than he'd had in the previous 6 months combined. At first, his thoughts had been focused on the immediate practical concerns. Would he be expelled from university? Would his parents find out? Would this appear on his permanent record? Would it affect his ability to find a job after graduation? These were the kinds of consequences that Marcus was familiar with thinking about, the external punishments that had always motivated his behavior in the past. But as the hours passed and the initial panic wore off, his thoughts kept returning to something else entirely. The expression on Guard Coleman's face, or rather, the complete lack of expression. The absolute stillness. The way the man had absorbed an electrical shock without so much as a flinch. Marcus had grown up in a household where everyone had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. His father was the kind of man who sent food back in restaurants if it wasn't exactly to his liking. His mother corrected other people's grammar in casual conversation. His younger sister threw tantrums when she didn't get her way that could be heard 3 streets over. The idea of simply not reacting to external stimuli was completely foreign to Marcus's experience. He tried to imagine himself in Guard Coleman's position, standing perfectly still for hours while strangers tried to provoke him, photographed him, made jokes at his expense. The thought made him physically uncomfortable. Marcus couldn't sit through a 2-hour lecture without fidgeting, checking his phone, or finding some excuse to leave early. The idea of maintaining perfect discipline for 4 hours straight seemed impossible. But it wasn't impossible. He had seen it with his own eyes. Guard Coleman had done exactly that, and Marcus was beginning to understand that it hadn't been easy. It had been a choice made over and over again, moment by moment, for the entire duration of his shift. Around 3 in the morning, a police constable brought Marcus a cup of tea and a sandwich. The officer was young, probably not much older than Marcus himself, with kind eyes and a Manchester accent that reminded Marcus of home. "First time in custody?" the constable asked, settling into a chair outside the cell. Marcus nodded, feeling embarrassed. "I've never even had a speeding ticket. What happened out there tonight?" "The reports say you attacked a Queen's Guard with a taser." "That's not something we see every day, even in central London." Marcus tried to explain, but found that he couldn't quite put it into words. How could he describe the frustration he had felt at being ignored? How could he make someone understand the anger that had built up inside him when Guard Coleman refused to acknowledge his existence? "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I wanted him to prove he was human." The constable nodded thoughtfully. "And did he?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. "What do you mean? Did he prove he was human? When you shocked him, did you learn what you wanted to learn?" Marcus thought about this for a long moment. "He proved he was more human than I am." "How's that?" "I can't control myself for 5 minutes. I couldn't even control myself long enough to walk away from a situation that was obviously stupid. But he spent 4 hours in perfect control, dealing with people like me, and never once lost his discipline." The constable smiled slightly. The Queen's Guard trained for years to develop that level of self-control. It's not something you're born with. It's something you build piece by piece through practice and dedication. "Have you ever met any of them?" "The guards, I mean." "My brother-in-law served with the Coldstream Guards before he left the army," the constable replied. "Lovely man, but serious about his duty. He used to tell me stories about the training they go through. Physical fitness, weapons training, ceremony, and protocol, but also mental discipline. Learning to ignore distractions, to maintain focus regardless of external circumstances." Marcus leaned forward, genuinely curious for the first time in hours. "What kind of mental training?" "Standing at attention for hours while instructors try to make you move. Maintaining military bearing while people yell at you. Play loud music, even throw things. Learning to separate your external performance from your internal experience. And people volunteer for this." The constable laughed. "The Queen's Guard is considered one of the most prestigious postings in the British Army. The men who serve in those positions are elite soldiers who have earned the right to wear those uniforms. Guard Coleman, the man you encountered tonight, is not just someone who stands around looking decorative. He's a trained warrior who happens to be performing ceremonial duties. Marcus felt the weight of this information settling on him like a heavy blanket. The officer who arrested me said he served in Afghanistan. Most of them have seen combat. That's part of what makes them so good at the ceremonial role. When you've been in actual life or death situations, maintaining discipline while tourists take photos is relatively simple. Marcus tried to imagine Guard Coleman in a war zone, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for himself and his fellow soldiers. The same man who had stood perfectly still while Marcus shocked him had probably faced enemy fire, had probably seen friends wounded or killed, had probably made sacrifices that Marcus couldn't even comprehend. "I feel like an idiot," Marcus said quietly. "That's a good sign," the constable replied. "People who don't feel like idiots after doing something idiotic are the ones you have to worry about." The rest of the night passed slowly. Marcus dozed fitfully on the uncomfortable bench, waking every hour or so with a start, momentarily confused about where he was. Each time he woke up, he found his thoughts returning to the same place, the moment when he had pressed the taser against Guard Coleman's leg, and the complete absence of any visible reaction. At the time, Marcus had interpreted that silence as a kind of weakness. He had thought that Guard Coleman's refusal to acknowledge him meant that the guard was somehow less than human, some kind of trained robot who couldn't think or feel or respond like a normal person. Now, sitting in a holding cell with nothing but time to think, Marcus was beginning to understand that the opposite was true. Guard Coleman's silence hadn't been the absence of humanity. It had been humanity at its highest level. It had been the choice to maintain dignity and purpose despite provocation, to honor a commitment regardless of personal comfort, to serve something larger than himself, even when that service required personal sacrifice. Marcus had never served anything larger than himself in his entire life. At 7 a.m, the same police constable returned to escort Marcus to a small interview room where he would meet with his solicitor before appearing before the magistrate. As they walked down the narrow hallway, Marcus found himself thinking about what his father would say when he found out about this. His father, who had always taught him that life was about getting what you wanted, about making sure people noticed you, about never letting anyone treat you like you didn't matter. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they reached the interview room. "Sure. Do you think I learned what I was supposed to learn from this?" The constable paused with his hand on the door handle. "I think you learned something. Whether it's what you were supposed to learn depends on what you do with the information." "What do you mean?" "You can walk away from this thinking that Guard Coleman is some kind of freak who doesn't react normally to things. You can decide that the whole system is stupid and that you were just having a bit of fun that got taken too seriously. You can blame the alcohol or your friends or bad luck. Or you can walk away thinking about what kind of person you want to be. You can ask yourself whether you want to be someone who attacks people when they don't give you the attention you think you deserve, or whether you want to be someone who can maintain dignity and purpose regardless of external circumstances." The constable opened the door to reveal a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a middle-aged woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Marcus's court-appointed solicitor. As Marcus sat down to hear about what would happen next, he realized that the constable was right. He had learned something important during the long night in the holding cell, but learning wasn't the same as changing. The real test would come later, when he was back in his normal life, faced with the same kinds of situations that had led him to this moment. Would he remember Guard Coleman's discipline when his own ego was threatened? Would he think about military bearing and service to something larger than himself when he was tempted to take shortcuts or demand attention he hadn't earned? Marcus didn't know the answers to these questions yet, but for the first time in his life, he understood that they were the right questions to be asking. The solicitor began explaining the charges against him and what would happen in court, but Marcus found his attention drifting back to that moment outside Buckingham Palace. Guard Coleman standing perfectly still, absorbing an electric shock without so much as a tremor, continuing to serve with dignity despite being attacked by a drunk student who had never learned the meaning of discipline. Marcus realized he wanted to become the kind of person who could stand like that, not literally, but metaphorically. Someone who could maintain his principles regardless of external pressure. Someone who could serve something larger than his own immediate desires. Someone who could face adversity with the kind of quiet strength he had witnessed in that sentry box. He didn't know if he could become that person, but he knew he wanted to try. The Westminster Magistrates' Court was nothing like the dramatic courtrooms Marcus had seen in films. The building was modern and sterile, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly pale and uncomfortable. Marcus sat in the dock wearing the same clothes he'd had on the night before, now wrinkled and smelling faintly of the holding cell's industrial disinfectant. His parents had driven down from Manchester overnight after receiving the call from his solicitor. Marcus could see them in the public gallery, his father looking furious and embarrassed, his mother looking worried and confused. They had barely spoken to him during their brief meeting before the hearing, and Marcus didn't blame them. What could he possibly say that would make sense of what he had done? The magistrate was a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Patricia Henley, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that suggested she had seen every possible variation of human stupidity during her years on the bench. She reviewed Marcus's file with the kind of methodical attention that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, looking up from the papers, "you're charged with assault occasioning actual bodily harm and possession of an offensive weapon. How do you plead?" Marcus's solicitor had explained that while Guard Coleman hadn't been physically injured, the law still considered what Marcus had done to be assault. The taser, despite being a cheap device ordered online, was legally classified as an offensive weapon. These weren't minor charges. "Guilty, Your Honor," Marcus said quietly. Mrs. Henley made a note and then looked at him directly. "Before I consider sentencing, I'd like to understand something. You're a 22-year-old university student with no previous criminal record. You come from what appears to be a stable, middle-class family. You have no history of violence or antisocial behavior. Can you help me understand what led you to attack a member of the Queen's Guard with an electrical device?" Marcus had been dreading this question all morning. His solicitor had prepared him for it, had suggested various ways he might respond that could minimize his culpability. He could blame the alcohol. He could claim it was a momentary lapse in judgment. He could say he was influenced by peer pressure or that he hadn't understood the seriousness of his actions. But sitting in that courtroom, looking at Mrs. Henley's expectant face and feeling the weight of his parents' disappointment behind him, Marcus found that he didn't want to make excuses anymore. "I think I wanted to prove that I was important," he said slowly. "The guard was ignoring me, and I couldn't handle being ignored. I've never really been ignored before in my life, and when it happened, I reacted badly." "You reacted by assaulting someone?" "Yes, Your Honor. I attacked someone because they wouldn't give me attention. It's embarrassing to say out loud, but that's what happened." Mrs. Henley studied him for a long moment. "Have you given any thought to why Guard Coleman was ignoring you?" Marcus had given this question a great deal of thought during his night in custody. Because he was doing his job. His job is to stand guard, not to entertain tourists. And even if that wasn't his job, he still wouldn't have owed me any attention just because I wanted it. "And what do you know about Guard Coleman's background?" "The police told me he served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. I learned that he's a trained soldier who has probably faced real danger, real challenges. What I did to him was probably the least threatening thing that happened to him that week." Mrs. Henley made another note. "Has this experience changed your perspective on anything, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus thought about Guard Coleman standing perfectly still, absorbing an electric shock without flinching, continuing to serve with dignity despite being attacked by someone who had never learned what service meant. "I think I've been confusing getting attention with earning respect," he said. "I've spent my whole life trying to make people notice me, but I've never done anything worth noticing. Guard Coleman doesn't need to demand respect because he's earned it through his service, through his discipline, through his commitment to something bigger than himself. And what do you plan to do with this new understanding?" This was the question that mattered most, and Marcus knew it. Anyone could express remorse in a courtroom. Anyone could claim to have learned a lesson. The real question was whether he would actually change his behavior going forward. "I want to earn the right to respect instead of just demanding it," Marcus said. "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know it starts with taking responsibility for my actions and trying to make amends for what I've done." Mrs. Henley leaned back in her chair and was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the file and considering Marcus's responses. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, you've committed a serious offense. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is not just an attack on an individual. It's an attack on an institution that represents centuries of British military tradition. The fact that Guard Coleman maintained his discipline despite your provocation doesn't diminish the seriousness of what you did." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had been hoping that his honesty and apparent remorse might result in a lighter sentence, but Mrs. Henley's tone suggested otherwise. "However," she continued, "I'm also mindful that you're a young man who appears to have genuinely learned something from this experience. Your willingness to take full responsibility for your actions and your understanding of why those actions were wrong suggests that you may not pose a continued threat to public safety." She paused again, flipping through the papers in front of her. "I'm going to sentence you to 200 hours of community service to be completed over the next 12 months. You'll be working with a veterans charity, helping to provide support services for former military personnel who are struggling with the transition to civilian life. You'll also pay a fine of £500 and court costs of £200. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. No prison time, no permanent criminal record if he completed the community service successfully. But more than that, the sentence felt appropriate. He would be serving people like Guard Coleman, people who had actually earned the respect that Marcus had always demanded without justification. Additionally, Mrs. Henley said, "I'm going to require that you write a formal letter of apology to Guard Coleman. This letter will be delivered through official channels, and Guard Coleman will have the option of whether or not to read it. You're not to attempt to contact him directly or to visit his place of work again." "Yes, Your Honor." "Mr. Thompson, I want you to understand something. You've been given a second chance here. Use it wisely. The veterans you'll be working with have made real sacrifices for this country. They've faced genuine hardship and danger. I expect you to approach this service with the respect and humility that they deserve." "I will, Your Honor." "See that you do." Court is adjourned. As Marcus stood up, he felt strangely lighter than he had in days. The sentence was fair, more than fair considering what he had done. More importantly, it gave him an opportunity to actually do something meaningful, something that might begin to balance out the stupidity and selfishness he had displayed outside Buckingham Palace. His parents were waiting for him outside the courtroom. His father's anger had apparently given way to relief that Marcus wasn't going to prison. His mother hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "For what? Getting arrested? For taking responsibility. For not making excuses. For being honest about why you did what you did." His father nodded, though he still looked troubled. "Your mother's right. What you did was inexcusable, but how you handled it in court showed maturity. Real maturity, maybe for the first time in your life." Marcus appreciated their support, but he knew that the real test was still ahead of him. It was easy to sound remorseful in a courtroom when the alternative was prison time. It was easy to make promises about change when you were facing serious consequences. The difficult part would be following through when he was back in his normal life, when the immediate consequences had faded and the temptation to return to his old patterns reasserted itself. That evening, Marcus sat in his small student flat and began writing the letter of apology to Guard Coleman. He wrote draft after draft, struggling to find words that could adequately express his remorse without sounding self-serving or insincere. How do you apologize for attacking someone? How do you acknowledge the magnitude of your mistake without making it seem like you're fishing for forgiveness? After 6 attempts, he settled on something simple and direct. "Guard Coleman, I am Marcus Thompson, the person who attacked you outside Buckingham Palace on October 18th. I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, inexcusable, and cowardly. You were performing your duty with honor and discipline, and I attacked you because I was too immature to handle being ignored. I have no excuse for my behavior, and I'm not writing this letter to ask for your forgiveness. I'm writing because you deserve to know that I understand the seriousness of what I did and that I'm committed to becoming a better person because of what you showed me that night. Your dignity and self-control in the face of my attack taught me more about strength and character than anything I've ever experienced. Thank you for that lesson, even though I didn't deserve to learn it. He signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it through the official channels the court had specified. He didn't expect a response, didn't think he deserved one. But writing the letter had forced him to confront the full reality of what he had done, and that confrontation was the beginning of the change he had promised Mrs. Henley he would make. The next week, Marcus began his community service at a veteran support center in South London. His supervisor was a former Royal Marine named David Walsh who had lost his left leg in an IED explosion in Helmand Province. David took one look at Marcus's file and smiled grimly. "So you're the university boy who tossed a Queen's Guard," he said. "This should be interesting." Marcus braced himself for anger, for lectures, for the kind of dressing down he probably deserved. Instead, David just handed him a mop and pointed toward a hallway that needed cleaning. "We'll start you off simple," he said. "Work your way up to the complicated stuff." As Marcus began mopping the floor, he realized that this was exactly what he needed. Not punishment, not lectures, but the opportunity to serve, to contribute something useful instead of just taking up space and demanding attention. For the first time since the night outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus felt like he was moving in the right direction. 3 years later, Marcus Thompson stood in the rain outside a small church in Leeds, watching as 6 uniformed soldiers carried a flag-draped coffin toward the waiting hearse. The funeral was for William Hayes, a former paratrooper who had struggled with PTSD after returning from his 3rd deployment in Afghanistan. Marcus had worked with William for 8 months at the Veterans Center, helping him navigate the bureaucracy of disability benefits and mental health services. William had never quite adjusted to civilian life. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to find meaning in a world that seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions he had faced in combat. All of it had eventually overwhelmed him. He died by suicide on a Tuesday morning in February, leaving behind a letter thanking the staff at the Veterans Center for trying to help him find his way home. Marcus watched the funeral cortege disappear around a corner and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Not guilt, exactly, because he had learned the difference between taking responsibility for your own actions and taking responsibility for things beyond your control. But a deep sense of obligation to honor William's service by continuing the work they had started together. The community service that had started as a legal requirement had become Marcus's career. After completing his original 200 hours, he had continued volunteering at the center while finishing his degree. Upon graduation, he had been offered a full-time position as a caseworker, helping veterans navigate the transition from military to civilian life. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly filling out forms, making phone calls, and listening to people tell stories about experiences he could barely imagine, but it was meaningful in ways that his previous ambitions had never been. David Walsh, his old supervisor who had become something like a mentor, found Marcus in the church parking lot after the funeral. David walked with a pronounced limp now, his prosthetic leg never quite working as well as he wanted it to. But he moved with the same quiet confidence that Marcus had learned to recognize in veterans who had made peace with their injuries. "Hard day," David said, lighting a cigarette despite the rain. "He was getting better," Marcus replied. "Or at least I thought he was. We had him set up with a good therapist. His benefits were finally coming through. He had started talking about maybe taking some college courses. Some of them don't make it," David said matter-of-factly. "That's not on you, Marcus. That's just the reality of what we do here." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He had learned a lot about himself over the past 3 years, but he still struggled with the desire to fix everything, to take on more responsibility than was reasonably his to bear. It was a different manifestation of the same ego that had led him to attack Guard Coleman, just pointed in a more constructive direction. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Do you think I'm doing this work for the right reasons?" David took a long drag on his cigarette and considered the question. "What do you think are the wrong reasons?" "Guilt. Trying to make up for what I did. Trying to prove to myself that I'm a good person now." "And what would be the right reasons?" Marcus had been thinking about this question for months, ever since he had started considering whether to apply for a supervisor position that would involve training new volunteers and caseworkers. Because the work needs to be done. Because these guys deserve support. Because I'm actually good at it. "Are you good at it?" Marcus thought about the veterans he had worked with over the past 3 years. Men and women who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, the Falklands. People who had made sacrifices he was still learning to understand, who had faced challenges that made his own problems seem insignificant. Most of them had found their way to some kind of stability with the center's help. Not all like William, but most. "I think so," Marcus said. "At least, I'm better at it than I expected to be." "That's because you listen," David said. "And you don't try to pretend you understand things you don't understand." A lot of people who work with veterans either treat us like we're broken or treat us like we're heroes. You just treat us like we're people. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the rain turn the church parking lot into a collection of small puddles. Marcus found himself thinking about Guard Coleman, as he often did during moments like these. He had never received a response to his letter of apology, which hadn't surprised him. But he had continued to think about that night outside Buckingham Palace, about the lesson in dignity and self-control that he hadn't known he was receiving at the time. "David," Marcus said suddenly, "what do you know about the Queen's Guards?" David raised an eyebrow. "That's a bit of a subject change. Why do you ask?" "The guard I attacked 3 years ago. I've been thinking about him a lot lately. About what he represented." "What did he represent?" Marcus struggled to put it into words. "Service, I guess. Commitment to something bigger than yourself. The ability to maintain your principles even when people are trying to provoke you." David smiled slightly. "Sounds like you learned something from him after all." "I think I did. But I'm wondering if I learned the right thing." "What do you mean?" Marcus kicked at a small stone, sending it skittering across the wet pavement. "I've been thinking that maybe I idealized him too much. Made him into some kind of perfect symbol instead of just a person doing his job. And I'm wondering if that's another way of avoiding the real work of becoming a better person myself." David nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I served with a few guys who ended up in the Guards after their regular service. They're good soldiers, well-trained, disciplined. But they're not superhuman. They have bad days, they get frustrated, they make mistakes like everyone else. The difference is that they've learned how to do their job regardless of how they're feeling in the moment. Is that what discipline really is? Doing your job regardless of how you feel. That's part of it. But it's bigger than that. Real discipline is about choosing to serve something larger than your immediate desires, even when that service is difficult or uncomfortable or thankless." Marcus thought about this as they walked back toward David's car. Over the past 3 years, he had learned to see his work at the Veterans Center in exactly these terms. Not as a way to feel good about himself, not as a method of earning forgiveness for his past mistakes, but as a commitment to be useful in whatever way he could manage. "I got a call yesterday," Marcus said as they reached the car, "from the Ministry of Defense. They want to interview me for a position working with active duty soldiers who are transitioning out of the military. That's a big opportunity." "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd think about it. It would mean leaving the center, leaving the people I've been working with here." David unlocked his car and paused with his hand on the door handle. "Marcus, can I give you some advice?" "Of course. Stop thinking about what you deserve or what you don't deserve. Stop thinking about whether you're qualified or unqualified based on what you did 3 years ago. Just think about where you can do the most good." As David drove away, Marcus stood in the rain for a few more minutes, thinking about William Hayes and Guard Coleman and all the veterans he had worked with over the past 3 years. He thought about the 18-year-old soldiers who would be leaving the military this year and next year and the year after that, many of them struggling to find their place in a civilian world that often didn't understand what they had experienced or what they had sacrificed. He pulled out his phone and called the number from the Ministry of Defense. "This is Marcus Thompson," he said when someone answered. "I'd like to schedule that interview." 6 months later, Marcus found himself back in London, working out a small office near Whitehall. His job was to help design and implement programs that would ease the transition from military to civilian life, working directly with soldiers during their final months of service to prepare them for the challenges they would face. It was more bureaucratic than his work at the Veterans Center had been, more meetings and reports and policy documents. But it was also more preventive, catching problems before they became crises, helping soldiers develop the tools they would need to succeed in civilian life rather than trying to fix things after they had already gone wrong. On his first day in the new position, Marcus walked past Buckingham Palace on his way to catch the tube home. He paused outside the gates, looking at the sentry box where a different guard now stood. This guard was younger than Coleman had been, but he held himself with the same perfect military bearing, the same unwavering focus. A group of tourists was clustered nearby, taking photos and making jokes, trying to get the guard to react to their antics. Marcus watched for a few minutes, remembering his own stupidity from 3 years ago, the anger and frustration that had led him to attack someone who was simply doing his job with dignity and professionalism. The guard maintained perfect discipline, just as Guard Coleman had. He absorbed the tourist provocations without reaction, continued to serve with honor despite the childish behavior of people who had never learned what service meant. Marcus turned away and headed for the tube station, thinking about the soldiers he would be working with tomorrow, the young men and women who would soon be trading military discipline for the complexities of civilian life. Some of them would struggle, as William Hayes had struggled. Some of them would find their way successfully into new careers and relationships and purposes. All of them would need support, understanding, and practical help from people who took their service seriously. As the train carried him home through the London Underground, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that drunken night outside Buckingham Palace. He was still the same person in many ways, still ambitious, still sometimes impatient, still learning to balance confidence with humility. But he had found something he had never had before, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own immediate needs and desires. He thought about Guard Coleman, wherever he was now, hoping that the man had never given another thought to the drunk university student who had attacked him with a taser. Hoping that Marcus's moment of stupidity had been just another forgettable incident in a career dedicated to something larger than personal recognition or validation. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a note to himself, write to Mrs. Henley to let her know how the community service led to career change. The magistrate who had sentenced him had given him exactly what he needed, even though he hadn't understood it at the time. Not punishment, but opportunity. Not condemnation, but a chance to learn what it meant to serve. The train emerged from the underground into the evening light, and Marcus looked out at the city where he had learned the difference between demanding respect and earning it, between seeking attention and deserving it, between being important and being useful. He still had Guard Coleman's discipline to thank for that education, even if the guard would never know it. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from people who never intended to teach them, delivered in moments when we're least prepared to learn them. Marcus Thompson had finally learned to listen,